Today our topic is US-China Politico-Strategic Competitiveness and Trade Rivalry. And what are the causes and trajectories and implications for the world? We are going to discuss on a research analysis of multi-authors. The authors' names are as Dr. Laura Van Daniels, Dr. Barbara Lippert, Professor Dr. Gunther Myhold, and Dr. Marco Overhaus, Dr. Michael Paul, Professor Dr. Volker Perthes, Dr. Peter Rodolph, Dr. Matthias Skels, Dr. Daniel Voisin, Dr. Gudrun Wacker, and Dr. Annegret Bendelik. There are some abbreviations. We must have to understand about those abbreviations before listening to the lecture. ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations. BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Asia. CGTN, China Global Television Network. CIA, Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. ECFR, European Council on Foreign Relations. EU, European Union. FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, a branch of United Nations. 5G, fifth generation standard for mobile telephony and internet. G20, group of 20 major industrialized nations and emerging economies. G7, group of 7 leading Western industrial nations. HGV, hypersonic glide vehicle. ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization. INF, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces. IFC, Information Fusion Center of Singapore Navy. IP, Internet Protocol. IT, Information Technology. ITU, International Telecommunication Union. IMF, International Monetary Fund. Mercosur, Mercado Common del Sur. NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. PIIE, Peterson Institute for International Economics, Washington, D.C. TFEU, Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. UNIDO, United Nations Industrial Development Organization, Vienna. UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East. VPN, Virtual Private Network, and WTO, World Trade Organization, Geneva. There are contents which we can divide into multi-headings. The first, that are dimensions of strategic rivalry, China, the United States, and Europe's place. Conflicts over trade, economic and financial policy. and the global power rivalry, technological dimensions, different leadership styles, international effects of China-America rivalry, new strategy for Europe, the Sino-American world conflict. We must have to critically understand the situation. China's rise as threat to American predominance or American hegemony, on the structure of the Sino-American conflict syndrome, the dimensions and dynamics of the rivalry, and the consequences. Chinese narratives about the United States. China as champion of the South. America blocking China's progress. A US-dominated world order. The United States under Donald Trump. Back to the future. A differentiated perception of Europe. American perceptions of China. Normative security and economic dimensions of criticism. Congress in the China debate. Moderate voices unheard in Washington. Security and security dilemmas in Sino-American relations. Beijing's perspective and Washington's perspective, the nuclear component, trade, economy and finance rivalries, conflicts, escalation risks, United States and China on economic collision course, power shifts and the new US trade policy, from integration to decoupling, consequences and escalation risks, Europe's positioning, digital spheres of influence. In digital, we can study about technopolitical spheres of influence. Technopolitical spheres of influence as a means to project power and optionals for third-party states. Values and orders, the ideological conflicts and challenges. In this order, the West's liberal ideas as threat to the Chinese Communist Party's claim to power, China's new paradigms for international cooperation, facing a new systemic competition, Trump and Xi clash of leadership styles, Donald Trump's transactional leadership style, Xi Jinping's transformative leadership style, collision of leadership styles, loss of trust and compliance, competition of leadership styles, strategic competition, and the repercussions of the US-China conflict on the multilateral order, growing rivalry between Beijing and Washington, the Bretton Woods institutions and the US-China conflict, the United Nations and the US-China conflict, and now the analysis, the outlook, positioning the European Union within the Sino-American rivalry, European unity and disunity over China, foreign policy and security policy, the European Union as trade and regulatory power, supranational geopolitics, appendix, which we have already, abbreviations we have already spoken about that. We are going to discuss on rivalry between the United States and China has become a paradigm of international relations over the past 2 years. It shapes both strategic debates and real political, military, and economic dynamics. Number 2, the dimensions of Sino-American competition over power and status include growing threat perceptions and an increasingly important political ideological component. And third, the US-China trade conflict is politically instrumental and closely bound up with the development of the world order. And the third, the crux of the technological dimension is not who sets the standards, but geopolitical power projection through technopolitical spheres of influence. The development and uses of technologies thus become part of a systemic competition. Through their respective leadership styles, Presidents Trump and Xi foment bilateral conflicts and, each in their own way, damage international rules and institutions. The Sino-American rivalry also undermines multilateral institutions such as the World Trade Organization. While Washington has withdrawn from a number of multilateral institutions, Beijing is expanding its influence in contexts like the United Nations. Europe needs to escape the bipolar logic that demands it choose between the American and Chinese economic, technological spheres. The European Union must develop a China policy for its drive towards sovereignty, that is the strategic autonomy, and that requires a supranational geopolitics. The first, that is the dimensions of strategic competitiveness, are the political rivalry, the China and the United States and the Europe's place. Rivalry between the United States and China has become a paradigm of international relations over the past 2 years. It shapes strategic debates and real political, military, and economic dynamics, and is likely to continue to do so for some time. That is not to say that the competition between Washington and Beijing, or even great power rivalry in general, determine all over international problems and conflicts. But the rivalry does increasingly frequently form the tense and such lens through which other actors view important developments and events. At least for the United States, it can be said that strategic rivalry with China has edged out the war on terror paradigm that had prevailed since 2001. All contributions to this publication, which have already told about the names of the political analysts and political scholars and strategic scientists and the authors who are already mentioned, and on the author's written arguments, and these were written before the corona crisis began. And like any global crisis, we see this pandemic will leave an impact on patterns of international governance, and that has impacted the international governance and cooperation for time being, and probably on the structures of the international system. So it is possible, but by no means certain, that the aftermath of the crisis may actually see global governance structures strengthened in individual policy realms, particularly with regard to global health. And that cannot happen without the buy-in of most, if not all. the major powers. But even with heightened cooperation in some policy fields, the rivalry between the United States and China will likely remain if not the defining issue in international relations for some time to come. In some areas, the pandemic may actually fuel the competition. This is already seen in the ideological realm, where China, after first being criticized by the way it handled the virus outbreak, now highlights the advantages of its own authoritarian governance system in responding to such crises. The pandemic may also witness some nations gaining soft power by showing solidarity, while others lose some of theirs for not doing so. Since 2017, China has been treated as a long-term strategic competitor in official US government strategy documents and in its London Declaration on December 2019. NATO spoke for the first time of the challenges and opportunities presented by China's influence in international policies. China's political elite is rightly convinced that the United States is seeking, at the very least, to prevent any further expansion of Chinese influence. And while disputes over trade policy and trade balances feature most prominently in the US President's statements and directly affect the global economy, they in fact represent but one aspect of the rivalry and by no means the most important. The conflict is, as Peter Rodolph shows, multidimensional. Analytical clarity is an absolute prerequisite. If Germany and the European Union are to pursue their own autonomous strategic approach to the Sino-American rivalry, and only if we understand the multidimensionality of the conflict constellation will we be able to find appropriate political answers and develop the necessary instruments. So it is a rivalry which is between the global powers. The issue at hand is global power, equilibria, and their status within the international system. There are grounds to believe that US President Donald Trump regards superiority and above all military dominance as an end in itself rather than simply a means to promote particular interests and values. President Xi Jinping appears to be driven more by a Chinese vision of world order in which superiority is both means and end. But the conflict also has security-related economic, technological, and ideological dimensions, as well as what one could call a personality dimension. The contributions in this volume, which we are discussing at this very time, which is endeavored of the various authors, we are going to examine each of these dimensions and their contexts, as well as the repercussions of US-China rivalry on international institutions and on Europe. The issues of relevance also encompass the respective influence of the established and the rising superpower on other states, regions, and societies. From the Chinese perspective, which the Hans Gunther Helpert and Gudrun Becker have shown, The United States will never voluntarily cede significant international influence to China. America regards China as a revisionist power whose long-term aim is global supremacy. This, as the contribution by Marco Overhaus, Peter Rodolphe, and Laura von Daniels demonstrates, is a matter of broad consensus in the United States across both main parties and throughout business, politics, and society as a whole. More considered positions do exist, but they tend to be marginalized. Real debate is confined largely to the question of the means by which the conflict is to be conducted. For that reason, too, hard security challenges escalate, leading to the emergence of a classical security dilemma, as Michael Paul and Marco Overhaus, the authors, have outlined. This applies especially strongly to China as a great power that is expanding its radius of action and in the process transitioning incrementally from the doctrine of coastal defense to maritime active defense. But it also applies to the United States, which see China's growing military capabilities as a threat not only to its own military bases in the Pacific, but also to its system of partnerships and alliances in the Asia-Pacific region, and in the longer term to its nuclear deterrent. And the conflicts over trade, economic and financial policy. The economic competition and conflicts over trade, economic and financial policy form a real dimension of rivalry in their own right, which predates the protectionist course adopted by the United States under President Trump. Washington's criticisms of Chinese trading practices, unfair competition, rule violations are widely shared in Europe. The trade conflict is, as both Hilpert and von Daniels explicate in their contributions, closely bound up with questions of world order that are of vital importance, especially from the European perspective. That applies, for example, to the future of binding multilateral trade rules and institutions. These issues are also of domestic political relevance in both states, with strong mobilizing potential that is not fully contingent on the context to which global developments actually affect the employment situation in particular sectors. All in all, however, Hilpert argues the material benefits accruing to both sides from their economic cooperation have declined in comparison to the period between 1990 and 2015. Bilateral trade between the United States and China is no longer a stabilizing factor capable of ameliorating political conflicts. Instead, trade conflicts are politically instrumentalized, although they may also represent the most easily untangleable knots in the complex web of US-China rivalry. Or put another way, the strategic rivalry between the United States and China will continue to exert decisive influence on international politics for the foreseeable future. Even if Washington and Beijing succeed in resolving important trade issues and manage to conclude a trade agreement before the upcoming US presidential elections, which are now running at this time in the United States. Technological dimensions. The rivalry runs deeper and will outlast any putative resolution of the trade disputes. Both absolute and relative prices are at stake. The question of who will secure the largest piece of the cake in the long term, for example, by defining the technical standards. And technological competition is always also a question of security. There is no other plausible explanation for the sharpening of competition and the growing mistrust that has in the meantime noticeable restricted exchange and cooperation in the technological sphere. As Matthias Sackels and Daniel Wilson, the authors, explained in their endeavors. So this competition also connects with geopolitical questions in the international and traditional sense. Techno-political spheres of influence built on digital products and services are no longer purely territorial, but still allow geopolitical power to be projected and international dependencies to be cemented. In the connection, questions of the development and use of technologies increasingly connect with political and ideological aspects. They become part of a system opposition for systemic competition concerning the international or internal order. The relationship between states and society, between government and governed, Hilpert addressed this political ideological dimension that located in a global competition between liberal and democratic paradigms on the one side and authoritarian on the other. Everywhere, including Europe, this might ostensibly be an internal debate, but it is co-terminated and it is co-determined by the polarization between the United States and China, and defending democratic values and liberal elements in the world order is plainly not a priority for the serving US president. But for Congress, both these concerns are front and center in the Sino-American rivalry, and both chambers have become working to promote more decisive policies in this respect. Most recently with the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act in November 2019. The debate in the United States is characterized by fear of the rise of China and the possibility of being overtaken. This is perhaps why, as Hilpert outlines, the Chinese elites also still feel insecure, threatened by liberal values and worldviews. That remains the case despite China having disproven the West's liberal expectation that democracy and rule of law would emerge more or less automatically if the country developed economically and generated growing prosperity. Chinese development model has been successful, and liberal values still remain attractive, especially to young, well-educated and mobile members of Chinese society. This explains the Chinese leadership's nervousness over Hong Kong, its apparently exaggerated fear of color revolutions, and its comprehensive efforts to secure its grip on power and ideally establish its own type of harmonious society by technological means. Technologies are, as Sackels and Wilson pointed out, not value neutral. The more technological developments touch on fundamental questions of political and social order, the more technological competition will be tied to the political, ideological dimensions of strategic rivalry, be it in data gathering, and processing, artificial intelligence, or biotechnology. Germany and the European Union will also have to address questions such as what it would mean for the European model of state and society, which is committed to the protection of individual rights. If Chinese technology investments were to enable a large-scale overflow of personal data, there is also a need for a critical investigation of how the development and export of surveillance technologies and social control techniques by Chinese high-tech firms not only assists authoritarian and repressive regimes, but also promotes the dissemination of illiberal concepts of governance and society. The different leadership styles, one can debate the extent to which the personal factor, the specific traits of Trump and Xi Jinping, represents the separate dimensions of the US-China rivalry in its own right. In any case, Gunther Myhold argues that different but in both cases very personal styles of leadership will continue to influence relations between the United States and China. Trump's transactional and Xi externally and internally transformative style are highly incompatible. They tend to undermine whatever basis of trust still remains, restrict the possibilities of diplomacy, and exacerbate bilateral conflicts. Other parts, including the European Union, might in certain cases gain room for maneuver of their own, but they will principally have to put their efforts towards upholding international rules and international institutions, which are being harmed in different ways by both Washington and Beijing. And the international effects, even if the constellation of conflict and competition described here is understood as a bilateral rivalry and to some extent plays out as such, its significance and consequences are global. It affects relationships with other powers, influences regional dynamics, even in Europe, shapes the work of international organizations and forums, such as the G20 or the United Nations and its agencies. And the Laura von Daniels described often enough undermines multilateral institutions. This is especially clear in the case of the World Trade Organization, whose rules have been violated by both sides and whose very function the Trump administration has sought to impair. China is establishing new international forums and organizations in line with its own Sino-centric concepts of order, especially in its own regional environment. But unlike the United States, China is showing no signs of withdrawing from international and multilateral institutions. Instead, it is working actively to expand its influence at the United Nations and within its agencies and programs. One channel by which this occurs, not least in the case of UN peacekeeping, is for China to assume greater responsibility and a larger share of the costs, but at the same time it seeks to establish its own political terms and values. In the language of the United Nations, whereas Trump took the United States out of the UN Human Rights Council, China has been working to establish its own ideas within it, for example, by relativizing the importance of individual human rights. The European Union and its member states are affected directly and indirectly by the Sino-American rivalry. Europe's take on China has become more critical. In Germany, probably more so than in other European Union member states, Europe no longer sees China just a negotiating partner with different interests and an economic competitor, but also a systematic rival promoting alternative models of governance. Nevertheless, from the European perspective, China remains a vital cooperation partner for tackling global challenges. First and foremost, but not exclusively in connection with climate protection, Europe cannot have any interest in a decoupling in the sense of a broad severing of technological and economic ties of the kind being discussed and to an extent also prepared in the United States. Like many other states and regional groupings, Europe will also have to resist the bipolar logic pressing it to choose between an American and a Chinese economic and technological sphere. Instead, it will have no alternative but to work towards sustainable long-term ties on the basis of a real interdependency and shared rules. Equidistance to China and the United States, as occasionally proposed by interested parties in European debates, is not an optional, however. For that, the gap between Europe and China, in terms of questions of values, the political system and the rules-based international order, is too large. And however great the difference may appear, the ties that bind the Euro-American community of values and security are likely to remain a great deal closer than the relationships of either the United States or the states of Europe to any other international partner. The new strategy for Europe and the Euro will, as Annegret Bandic and Barbara Lippert underlined, have to discover its own strengths and develop a China policy that is not conceived as a country strategy, but as part of the comprehensive European strategy of self-assertion, or in other words, a part of striving for greater European sovereignty or strategic autonomy. Especially in connection with China, this demands more supranationally and supranationality, or what Bandic and Lippert call a supranational geopolitics. Work is already underway on instruments that could serve a confident, prudent European policy towards China, such as foreign investment screening complemented by national legislation. The trick is to prepare Europe for harsher competition by strengthening social and technological resilience without weakening cooperation, and by strengthening social and technological resilience without weakening the interdependency and other cooperations. Such a strategy should apply to not only the direct relationship to China, but also in Europe's international and global profile as a whole. Many states and societies in Asia and Africa value Chinese economic engagement and its Belt and Road Initiative, but fear one-sided dependencies. Here the European Union's connectivity strategy towards Asia represents a sensible approach. The same applies to the already considerable funds that Europe provides for American to African infrastructure, for example via the European Investment Bank. Finally, European states will have to expand their engagement in the United Nations, other multilateral organizations and forums. In the process, they may find themselves having to fill gaps created by the disinterest or withdrawal of the current administration in Washington. That offers an opportunity to demonstrate the Europe's understanding of multilateralism and international rules differs fundamentally from Sinocentric multibilateralism. Now, the Peter Rodolphe has also criticized on the Sino-American world conflict. The strategic rivalry between the United States and China risks spiraling into a multi-layered world conflict that presents economic and military dangers. The rivalry between the two great powers is beginning to structure international relations and bears the potential to bring forth a new geo-economic world order. In comparison to past decades, the question of who gains more from economic exchange and concern over the problematic security implications of economic interdependence now play a much more important role. If economic and security interests are placed on a permanently new footing under these aspects, the level of integration could decline to a point where it could be regarded as a kind of deglobalization. Chinese rise as threat to American predominance. The United States, the rise of China, that is widely regarded as a danger to America's own dominant position in the international system. Although the idea of an unstoppable Chinese economic and military expansion and relative loss of power for the United States is based on questionable assumptions and projections. China is generally the only country with the potential to threaten the status of the United States. Power shifts, it is argued, could endanger the stability of the international system if the predominant and the rising power prove incapable of reaching an understanding over governance and leadership in the international system. This is the implication of the power transition theory that has been avidly discussed in both countries, and in recent years colored the public debate in the guise of the Thucydides trap. The theory itself is problematic, its explanatory value contested, but as an interpretive framework, it influences perceptions both in the United States and in China. On the one hand, this framework highlights the risks of transition. On the other, it sees individual conflicts of a more regional or local nature coalescing to a global hegemonic conflict. And now, on the structure of the Sino-American conflict syndrome. A string of elements make up the US-China conflict syndrome. Its bases are regional and increasingly also global. Status rivalry. China's growing power has awakened American fears over its status as the only international superpower. Some would argue that states are the protagonists representing them, seek status as an end in itself, as postulated in approaches grounded in social psychology. In this understanding, higher status engenders the psychological gratifications of superiority over other individuals or states, and the prospect of losing this status threatens one's own identity. But status is also associated with material gains. In the longer term, China threatens not only Americans' status as the leading power, but also the privileges and economic advantages that ensure from that status. China could, the skeptics argue, acquire dominant global political, economic and technological influence, set rules and standards across the board, and establish a kind of illiberal sphere of influence. In this case, the United States would no longer be able to guarantee the security and prosperity it has enjoyed to date. This competition for influence melts with an ideological antagonism. Of course, the human rights situation in China has always been a cause of intermittent friction in US-China relations. But as long as the hope survived that China would eventually liberalize, China was not perceived as an ideological antagonist in the United States. From the Chinese perspective, this ideological dimension has always been more salient. Given that Western concepts of liberal democracy and freedom of expression threaten the ideological dominance of the Chinese Communist Party, it must be expected, however, that the systemic conflict will loom increasingly large on the American side, sometimes interpreted as a clash between liberal democracy and what is occasionally referred to as digital authoritarianism. Highlighting the ideological conflict might be implied to mobilize sustained domestic support for a power clash with China that cannot come free of economic costs. Even if the ideological conflict is not the most important layer, it must certainly be expected that an increasingly pointed ideological difference will intensify threat perceptions and thus strengthen the security dilemma between the United States and China. Since the Taiwan crisis of 1995-96, both sides again see each other as potential military adversaries and align their planning accordingly. So the security dilemma shifts the structure of the relationship. Neither side is especially sensitive to the reciprocal threat perceptions this produces, because the antagonists each see themselves as defensive, peaceful powers, but suspect the respective other of aggressive offensive intentions. The dimensions and dynamics of the rivalry. Given that China and United States are political and potential military adversaries, and not merely systemic antagonists competing over status, the relationship between the two must be understood as a complex strategic rivalry. This is especially clear on China's maritime periphery, where the rivalry is dominated by perception of military threats and the American view that China is seeking to establish an exclusive sphere of influence in East Asia. In South China Sea, Washington's insistence on unhindered access and freedom of navigation collides with China's efforts to create a security zone and counter America's ability to intervene. The geopolitical conflict over the South China Sea is, moreover, interwoven with the nuclear dimension. China appears to be turning the South China Sea into a protected basin for nuclear-armed submarines to safeguard its second strike capability, which is the United States. Technological dimensions of global competition for influence. There are also military threat perceptions, albeit less important, in the global competition for influence, which in the meantime also encompasses the Arctic. The present U.S. administration is convinced the Chinese growing global economic and political presence comes at the expense of the United States. In response, Washington is applying pressure and incentives to dissuade other states from expanding their economic relations with China. The global competition for influence is intimately bound up with the technological dimension of the US-China rivalry, which concerns technological predominance in the digital age. What makes this dimension of the conflict so crucial is that technological leadership creates global competitiveness advantage and secures the basis for military superiority. As reflected in the campaign against Hawaii, we are witnessing a turn away from the positive sum logic in economic relations with China. As long as Washington was not afraid of the rise of a strategic rival, the economic logic predominated. And in absolute terms, the United States profited from economic exchange relations that China may have derived relatively larger benefits played no real role. This economic logic of absolute gains was tied to an expectation that economic interdependence would have cooperation promoting and peace stabilizing effects. Now fears that China is growing into a global strategic rival are eclipsing the economic logic. Under Trump, the security logic now dominates both rhetoric and practice. In association with concerns over the relative distribution of gains and the view that economic interdependence has negative consequences for the technological basis of military superiority. And now the consequences. If the strategic rivalry between the United States and China consolidates into a lasting global conflict constellation, this could set in motion a kind of deglobalization, ultimately leading to two parallel orders, one dominated by the United States, the other by China. If the US-China conflict continues to sharpen and accelerates the bipolarization of the international system, the basis for global multilateralism could disappear. And the US-China world conflict confronts Germany and the European Union with the question of the extent to which and terms under which they should support the United States against China. One thing appears certain: whether President Trump is re-elected or a Democrat enters the White House in January 2021, the strategic rivalry with China will shape US foreign policy. The next part of this rivalry and competition will be discussed in the second IDO, our video program.